There is a building on North Broad Street in Philadelphia, plain and unremarkable, the kind of place 1,000 people might walk past without a second look. And yet, in his final years, that building was home to a man who had once stood at the absolute summit of the most brutal sport on earth. A man who had earned millions of dollars in some of the most famous fights ever staged. A man who, on one unforgettable night in March of 1971, did something no human being had ever done before him. He beat Muhammad Ali. His name was Joseph William Frazier. The world knew him as Smokin Joe. And the story of how he went from the top of the world to a dramatically reduced final chapter is one of the most quietly heartbreaking tales in all of American sports. By the time he reached his 60s, the fortune was gone. The peak earning years were long behind him, and the money that had once flowed in had been scattered, lost, and by some accounts, taken. In late September of 2011, doctors delivered the news that he had liver cancer. He was placed in hospice care in Philadelphia. And on November 7th, 2011, Joe Frazier passed away. He was 67 years old. He had been diagnosed just 4 or 5 weeks before the end. How does a world heavyweight champion lose nearly everything? How does the first man ever to defeat Muhammad Ali end up surviving on so little? There are threads here that lead into the darkest corners of trust and money. A disputed land sale, a signature he insisted was forged, a foundation meant to help troubled children that quietly folded, and a city that chose to build a towering statue of a fictional boxer named Rocky, while the real champion lived just a few miles away. To understand how it all came apart, you have to go back to the very beginning, back to a 10-acre patch of farmland in South Carolina, back to a tractor accident that happened the very year Joe Frazier was born. Joseph William Frazier came into the world on January 12th, 1944, in Beaufort, South Carolina. He was the 12th child of Dolly Alston Frazier and her husband, Reuben. 12 children, a house full of mouths to feed in a part of the country where feeding them was never simple. The family was raised in Laurel Bay, a rural community in Beaufort County, where they worked as sharecroppers on 10 acres of farmland. Sharecropping was not ownership. It was a cycle that kept black families tied to land they could never truly call their own, working from sunup to sundown for a fraction of what they grew. And from the very start, this was a family that understood physical suffering. The same year Joe was born, his father, Reuben Frazier, lost his left hand and part of his forearm in a tractor accident. Imagine that. A man trying to provide for a dozen children in the rural South, now doing it with one good arm. The Fraziers knew hardship not as an abstract idea, but as a daily companion. And there was something heavier still hanging over their world. The reality of being black in the segregated South of the 1940s. Dolly Frazier once described the brutal logic of Southern justice in words that still chill the blood. She said that if you were a good workman, the white man would take you out of jail and keep you busy on the farm. Read that again slowly. Human beings, valued not for their dignity, but for their labor. Justice bent to serve the landowner. That was the world young Joe was born into. A world of cruel societal barriers, where a black boy's worth was measured by his usefulness in the field. In a household shaped by relentless labor and a father missing part of one arm, no one could have guessed what was coming. But a single offhand comment from an uncle was about to set the course of this boy's entire life. It started with a prophecy. One day, Joe's uncle Israel looked at the boy's thick, stocky build, took the measure of him, and said something that would never leave the child's mind. That boy, he said, was going to be another Joe Louis. Joe Louis, the Brown Bomber. The heavyweight champion, who was, in those years, perhaps the most admired black man in all of America. To compare a poor sharecropper's son in Beaufort to Joe Louis was to plant a dream where none had any business growing. But the dream took root immediately. The very next day, young Joe got to work. He took an old burlap sack and filled it with whatever he could find: rags, corncobs, a brick, and Spanish moss, the wispy gray plant that hangs from the oak trees of the Carolina Low Country. He hung that homemade heavy bag from an oak tree in the backyard. And then he hid it. For years, by his own account, nearly every single day, he beat that makeshift bag for an hour at a time. 6, 7 years of it. He had no gloves, of course. So he wrapped his hands with whatever was available: his father's neckties, his mother's stockings, his sister's stockings. A boy in the rural South, building a fighter's discipline out of garbage and determination. The dream had a flickering image to chase, too. Reuben Frazier had bought a black and white television set in the early 1950s, a rare luxury in a sharecropper's home. And on that little screen, the family watched the great fighters of the era: Sugar Ray Robinson, Rocky Marciano, Willie Pep, Rocky Graziano. Joe's mother would sell drinks for a quarter as the neighbors gathered to watch. The whole scene was working-class America at its most hopeful, a family turning a few coins and a borrowed dream into something that felt like possibility. But before Joe Frazier ever threw a punch in a real ring, his most important weapon, his left arm, would be permanently damaged. And it would happen because of a 300-pound hog and a single brick. Every great fighter has an origin story for his signature punch. For Joe Frazier, that story begins not in a gym, but in a barnyard, with him running for his life. The Frazier family kept a hog, and not a small one. This animal weighed some 300 pounds. One day, young Joe found himself being chased by it. In the scramble to get away, he fell. And when he hit the ground, his left arm came down hard against a brick. The arm was badly torn. In a family with money, this would have meant a trip to the doctor, stitches, perhaps a proper setting of the limb. But the Fraziers were sharecroppers. They could not afford a doctor. And so the arm did the only thing it could. It healed on its own, in its own crooked way. The result was permanent. Joe Frazier was never again able to fully straighten that left arm. For the rest of his life, it carried a slight, unmovable bend. He took that arm into every single fight of his entire boxing career. Now, here is where the cruelty of his childhood became the architecture of a legend. Because that left arm, the damaged one, the one that could not extend all the way, became the source of the most feared weapon in heavyweight boxing: Joe Frazier's left hook. A short, vicious, rising punch that detonated on contact and accounted for most of his knockouts. There is something almost poetic in it, and something deeply sad, too. The poverty that denied him a doctor as a boy shaped the very tool that would one day make him rich and famous. The bent arm of a frightened child became the hammer that would flatten the greatest names in the sport. But that bent left arm would not begin its work in South Carolina. Because at 15, Joe witnessed something on a white-owned farm so disturbing that it drove him out of the South for good. By the time he was 15 years old, Joe Frazier was working on a farm owned by a family named Bellamy, and it was there that he saw something he could never unsee. One day, a young black boy, about 12 years old, accidentally damaged one of the Bellamy's tractors. It was a mistake, the kind any child might make. But the response was savage. The white man flew into a rage and whipped that boy with his belt, right there in the open field. And young Joe Frazier watched the whole thing. He did not stay silent. He told his black friends what he had seen. In the segregated South of the late 1950s, that was a dangerous thing for a black teenager to do, to speak openly about the cruelty he had witnessed at the hands of a white landowner. Word traveled, and Joe understood in that moment that Beaufort was no longer safe for him. His mother understood it too. Dolly Frazier looked at her son and gave him the kind of advice that only a mother living under deeply rooted injustice could give. She told him, in words that carry both love and fear, that if he couldn't get along with the white folks, then he should leave home, because she did not want anything to happen to him. Think about what those words really meant. A mother telling her own child to go, hundreds of miles away, alone, because staying might cost him his life. That was the price of being black in that time and place. So Joe went. There were no tearful goodbyes, no grand farewell. He packed quickly and climbed aboard the first bus heading north. He later described it in unforgettable terms. He said he climbed on the dog's back, the jog being the Greyhound bus, and rode through the night. It was 1959. He was 15 years old, and he was on his own. The bus carried him to Philadelphia, a northern city full of strangers, cold winters, and possibility. A frightened, determined teenager with a permanently bent left arm and a dream his uncle had planted years before. He had no idea that the city he was riding toward would one day crown him, betray him, and bury him. The cold northern city did something for Joe Frazier that the warm South never could. It gave him a gym, a target, and a way to turn all that backyard pounding into something real. And in Philadelphia, a city that has always loved a fighter, the sharecropper's sun began to rise. Between 1962 and 1964, Frazier captured the Golden Gloves heavyweight championship 3 years in a row, 3 straight titles. He was becoming a feared regional power, a young man with a relentless style and that strange bent left arm, delivering punches that other amateurs simply could not withstand. And then came the strangest twist of his early career. Joe Frazier almost did not go to the Olympics at all. In 1964, the man who had qualified as America's heavyweight representative was Buster Mathis. But Mathis got injured, and so Frazier, the runner-up, was sent to the Tokyo Games as a replacement. A man bound for Olympic glory, almost by accident, stepping in because someone else got hurt. What happened in Tokyo would define his character for the rest of his life. In the semifinal bout against Vadim Yemelyanov of the Soviet Union, Frazier broke his thumb mid-fight. A serious injury, the kind that ends most men's tournaments on the spot. But Joe Frazier told no one. He went back to his room and quietly soaked the broken thumb in hot water and Epsom salts, treating it himself in private rather than risk being pulled from competition. And he made himself a promise, the kind of promise that reveals exactly who a man is. Pain or not, he declared, Joe Frazier of Beaufort, South Carolina, was going for gold. And he got it. He fought through the final on a broken thumb and won the gold medal by a 3-2 decision. It was the only boxing gold medal won by an American at those entire games. One man, one broken thumb, one secret carried all the way to the podium. That gold medal made Joe Frazier a name. And it brought a group of Philadelphia businessmen knocking at his door with a proposition that would launch his professional career and, decades later, raise hard questions about money and trust. An Olympic gold medal is a beautiful thing to hang on a wall. It does not pay the rent. And so the question facing Joe Frazier in late 1964 was the question facing every poor young champion before and since. How do you turn talent into a living? The answer came through his trainer, a sharp and demanding man named Yancey Durham, known to everyone as Yank. Durham helped assemble a group of local Philadelphia businessmen into a syndicate called Cloverley. These investors put money behind Frazier, covering his expenses and allowing him to train full-time without worrying about how he would eat. It was a smart, modern arrangement, a foundational financial structure built entirely around the body and fists of one young man. And at first, the investment looked brilliant. Frazier turned professional in 1965, and he came out like a storm. His debut ended in a first-round technical knockout of a fighter named Woody Goss. He won 3 more bouts that year, every single one by knockout, and not one of them lasted past the 3rd round. This was not a boxer who outpointed opponents. This was a man who walked through them, applying relentless pressure until they fell. But behind the spectacular start, Frazier was hiding a second devastating secret. Later that same year, according to his own account, a training accident left him legally blind in his left eye. Half his vision gone. Now think about what that meant for a professional fighter. A blind eye should have ended his career before it truly began. By his own telling, during pre-fight medical examinations, when the doctors asked him to cover one eye and read the chart, Frazier would cover his already blind left eye a second time while pretending to switch hands. The commission physicians, by his account, never caught on. If that account is true, and it comes chiefly from Frazier himself, then the man was fighting much of his legendary career half-blind, bent-armed and half-sighted, hiding both injuries from the world. The same iron secrecy that carried him through Tokyo now carried him into the heavyweight elite. Half-blind and bent-armed, this sharecropper's son was about to climb toward the heavyweight crown and straight into a collision with the most famous athlete on earth. History remembers Joe Frazier and Muhammad Ali as bitter enemies, but the truth, the forgotten truth, is far more painful than any rivalry, because before they were enemies, they were friends. And Joe Frazier was one of the few men who stood up for Ali when it cost him nothing but trouble to do so. Here is what set the whole drama in motion. Muhammad Ali had been stripped of his world heavyweight title for refusing to accept the military draft during the Vietnam War. The crown sat vacant, and the boxing world scrambled to fill it. The World Boxing Association organized an elimination tournament to crown a new champion. And Joe Frazier, on the advice of his trusted advisor, Eddie Futch, refused to take part. He boycotted the tournament in protest of Ali being stripped of the title, even though Frazier himself was the top-ranked contender and stood to benefit most from the whole arrangement. It was a principled stand, and it cost him. But Frazier built his claim another way. On February 16, 1970, at Madison Square Garden, he faced the man who had won that WBA tournament, Jimmy Ellis. The fight ended when Ellis's trainer, the legendary Angelo Dundee, would not let his man come out for the 5th round after 2 knockdowns in the 4th. With that victory, Joe Frazier became the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world in 1970. And here is the part that makes the later bitterness so heartbreaking. During Ali's 3-year exile from the ring, Joe Frazier was his friend. Frazier lent Ali money when Ali had none coming in. He testified before Congress on Ali's behalf. He even petitioned President Richard Nixon to have Ali's right to box restored. Frazier supported Ali's right to refuse the draft on principle, reportedly saying that if Baptists weren't allowed to fight, then he wouldn't fight either. Joe Frazier helped get Muhammad Ali back into the ring. And when Ali finally returned, he would repay that kindness by turning the entire nation against the very man who had stood beside him. On March 8, 1971, 2 undefeated heavyweight champions stepped into the ring at Madison Square Garden, and the entire world stopped to watch. They called it simply the fight of the century. And for once, the hype was no exaggeration. It was an event unlike anything the sport had ever seen. An international television audience. A media frenzy so intense it bordered on hysteria. 2 unbeaten men, each with a legitimate claim to be the best heavyweight alive, finally settling it with their fists. Frazier, the undisputed champion, came in undefeated. Ali, the returning legend, came in undefeated. One of those perfect records was about to be destroyed. But the build-up carried a poison that would never fully drain away. Ali, the master of promotion, turned the fight into something far larger and far uglier than sport. He transformed it into what was described as a cultural and political referendum, casting himself as the revolutionary, the civil rights champion, the voice of Black America, and casting Frazier as the establishment man, the so-called white man's hope. It was a cruel and dishonest framing. This was Joe Frazier, the sharecropper's son, the boy driven out of the segregated South, the man who had lent Ali money and fought for his return. And now he was being painted before the whole world as a tool of the very system that had nearly crushed him as a child. That framing would haunt and define public perception of Frazier for the rest of his life. On the night itself, Frazier answered the only way he knew how. He won. He defeated Muhammad Ali by unanimous decision, sealing the victory with a knockdown in the 15th round, delivered by that crooked, devastating left hook. He had done what no man on earth had ever done. He had beaten Ali. The cost was staggering. Ali was rushed to a hospital to check whether his badly swollen jaw was broken, and Frazier, the winner, spent time in the hospital himself in the following month. His body pushed past its limits, his condition worsened by hypertension and a kidney infection. He had won the greatest fight in boxing history, but the wound from being branded the white man's hope would never heal, and his next great test would not even involve Ali. It would come in Jamaica against a younger, terrifying giant. After the highest peak comes the steepest fall, and few falls in boxing history were as sudden or as brutal as the one Joe Frazier suffered on January 22nd, 1973, in Kingston, Jamaica. Frazier walked into that ring as the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, carrying a perfect professional record of 29 wins and 0 losses. He was the favorite. He had beaten Ali. He was, by every measure, the king of the division. Across from him stood a young, unbeaten challenger, a towering and frightening puncher named George Foreman. What followed was not a fight. It was a demolition. Foreman was simply too big, too strong, and too powerful. He towered over the more compact champion and held a significant reach advantage, and from the opening bell, he dominated. Frazier, the man known for relentless forward pressure, the man who walked through everyone, could not get close enough to do his work. And then the knockdowns began. Over the course of just 2 rounds, George Foreman knocked Joe Frazier down 6 times. 6 times the champion crashed to the canvas. 6 times he dragged himself back up, because getting up was the only thing Joe Frazier had ever known how to do. But there is a limit, even for a man like that. The fight was stopped. Foreman won by technical knockout. And in 2 short rounds, Joe Frazier's undefeated record and his world championship were both gone. It was a stunning, humbling defeat for a man who had stood at the very top of the sport less than 2 years earlier. The crown that had cost him so much, the crown he had won by beating Ali in the most famous fight ever staged, had been ripped away by a younger, stronger man. And the cruelty did not stop there. That same year, Joe Frazier suffered another devastating loss, one that had nothing to do with boxing. His chief trainer and manager, the man who had built Cloverlay, found him investors, and guided his entire career, Yank Durham, passed away in August of 1973. In a single year, Frazier lost his title and the most trusted man in his corner. Wounded, dethroned, and grieving, Joe Frazier now faced the prospect of one more war with the man who had branded him before the world. The third and final chapter of the Ali rivalry was coming, in a place called Manila, and it would take something from both men that neither would ever get back. Before the third and final war, there was a rematch, and it did not go Joe Frazier's way. On January 28, 1974, the 2 old rivals met again in New York City. This time there was no title on the line, just pride and old grievances. And this time it was Ali who walked away the winner, taking a 12-round unanimous decision. The score now stood at 1 apiece. Everything would come down to a third meeting. That meeting arrived on October 1st, 1975, in Metro Manila in the Philippines. They called it the Thrilla in Manila, and it would become known as one of the most savage fights in the history of the sport. But before the first bell, Ali went back to the cruel playbook that had wounded Frazier so deeply years before. He mocked his opponent with deeply dehumanizing language, words that carried unmistakable racial overtones, comparisons no black man should ever have aimed at him by another. These were not harmless taunts. They were remarks that caused lasting pain, the kind of insult that burrows in and never quite leaves. For Joe Frazier, a proud man who had once stood beside Ali when it mattered, the humiliation cut to the bone. Inside the ring, under oppressive, suffocating heat that pushed both men toward collapse, the fight became something almost beyond sport. At one point, Ali looked at Frazier and said, "They said you were through, Joe." And Frazier, gasping, swinging, refusing to break, answered him with 2 words that summed up his entire life. They lied. For 14 brutal rounds, these 2 aging warriors emptied themselves into each other. Neither would yield. And then came the finish that boxing has argued about ever since. Frazier's corner, led by the wise and respected Eddie Futch, decided their fighter would not come out for the 15th round. There are 2 ways to see that moment, and honesty demands telling both. To some, Futch robbed Joe Frazier of a possible victory in the defining contest of his life, ending the bout just as Ali himself was reportedly desperate to have his own gloves cut off. To others, Futch performed an act of mercy and protection, guarding what remained of Frazier's already damaged eyesight, and perhaps saving his life. What is not in dispute is the toll. Both men were hollowed out. Both left a part of themselves in that ring in Manila and never fully got it back. Manila left Joe Frazier a diminished fighter. But the deepest wound of his life would not come from a glove. It would come decades later from men he trusted with his money and his land. After Manila, the end came slowly, the way it so often does for great fighters who cannot quite believe their time has passed. Frazier stepped into the ring with George Foreman a second time, and once again, the giant proved too much. That defeat pushed him toward the exit, and in 1976, Joe Frazier retired from boxing. But retirement rarely takes the first time. In 1981, he came back for one more fight, a single bout that proved the fire was no longer enough to win. After that, he walked away for good. His final professional record stood at 32 wins, 4 losses, and 1 draw. And here is the detail that tells you everything about the level he competed at. In his entire career, Joe Frazier lost to only 2 men, Muhammad Ali and George Foreman, both of them former Olympic champions and world heavyweight title holders. He never lost to anyone ordinary. He only fell to the giants of his age. The honors poured in, and they were considerable. The Ring magazine named him Fighter of the Year 3 times, in 1967, 1970, and 1971. The Boxing Writers Association of America bestowed the same honor on him in 1969, 1971, and 1975. In 1990, he was enshrined as part of the inaugural induction class of the International Boxing Hall of Fame, one of the very first names ever called. And the International Boxing Research Organization would come to rate him among the 10 greatest heavyweights ever to lace up gloves. By any measure of glory, Joe Frazier was secure in history. The plaques, the rankings, the titles, the recognition of the experts who study the sport, all of it placed him among the immortals. And yet, beneath that glittering surface, something was already quietly coming apart. The honors said one thing about his standing, but the financial foundation behind the legend, the stability a champion of his stature should have enjoyed, was eroding in silence. The trophies and the rankings told one story. The address where Joe Frazier actually lived was about to tell a very different one. For decades, the heart of Joe Frazier's world sat at 2917 North Broad Street in Philadelphia. There, he owned and managed Joe Frazier's Gym, a place where he lived and trained, where young fighters came to learn from a master, and where the rhythm of the heavy bag echoed the same sound a teenage boy had once made in a South Carolina backyard. By widely circulated accounts, he reportedly made his home above that gym in his later years, though the precise details of those living arrangements have never been firmly documented. It was here that Frazier tried to give back. Alongside a man named Peter Bouchard, he formed the Smokin Joe Frazier Foundation, created to help troubled and in-need young people, the kind of kids who reminded him of the boy he had once been. Bouchard set out to do something that should have been obvious for a city that loved its fighters. He tried to get a bronze statue of Joe Frazier erected in Philadelphia. The city declined. Instead, Philadelphia chose to honor a different boxer entirely, a fictional one. The statue that went up, the one tourists climbed the museum steps to photograph, was of Rocky Balboa, a character from the movies. A made-up fighter from a screenplay was immortalized in bronze, while the real native son, the genuine world heavyweight champion who lived just a few miles away, was passed over. For a man already branded unfairly during the Ali years, it was one more public wound, the city he had called home for half a century, choosing make-believe over the living legend in its midst. Then, the slow fade accelerated.
As Frazier's health began to decline, the foundation he had built to lift up struggling children was quietly shelved.
And in the middle of 2009, he sold the gym itself, letting go of the very place that had defined who he was after the fighting stopped. The bag, the ring, the address that had been his anchor, all of it slipped away. The gym was gone, the statue had gone to a phantom, but the cruelest loss of all involved a different piece of property entirely, and a signature Joe Frazier swore he never wrote. This is the part of the story that turns from disappointment into something far darker. Because the decline of Joe Frazier's fortune was not simply the tale of a fighter who spent too freely or invested poorly. Woven through it is an allegation of outright betrayal by people he trusted. At the center of it sat a parcel of land, roughly 140 acres. According to accounts of the dispute, Frazier came to believe that this land had been sold without his knowledge, and that the documents authorizing the sale carried his signature, a signature he insisted he had never given. He maintained that his name had been forged, that he had no idea the transaction had even taken place. So Joe Frazier did what a wronged man does. He sued his business partners, alleging that his signature on those documents was a forgery, and that the sale had happened entirely without his consent. The stakes were enormous. In the years that followed, that same parcel of land was subdivided into a residential community, and by 2011, it was estimated to be worth something on the order of $100 million. Imagine the weight of that. A piece of property that may have been worth a fortune, gone, while the man who claimed ownership lived in dramatically reduced circumstances. As for how the legal battle ended, the outcome of that lawsuit was never widely reported. There is no clear public record of a verdict, a settlement, or vindication. The fight simply faded from the headlines, unresolved in the eyes of the world. What is clear is the larger pattern of his financial life. The millions earned in those historic fights did not last. By the end, those who knew him spoke of a generous man, perhaps too generous, a champion who trusted the wrong people and never mastered the business side of his own fame. His finances had been dramatically reduced from his peak earning years, the fortune scattered to the winds. And now, with his money gone and his land lost to a dispute he could not seem to win, the final and most personal battle of Joe Frazier's life was already beginning inside his own body. In his last years, the body that had absorbed so much punishment began to fail him in quieter, crueler ways. He had been diagnosed with diabetes and high blood pressure, the slow ailments that catch up to so many. But the final blow came in late September of 2011, when doctors told him he had liver cancer. It moved with terrible speed. He was placed in hospice care in Philadelphia, the city that had crowned him and overlooked him in equal measure. He had been given his diagnosis just 4 or 5 weeks before the end, and on November 7th, 2011, Joe Frazier passed away at the age of 67. He left behind a complicated heart. To the very end, his feelings toward Muhammad Ali remained tangled in bitterness and contempt, the residue of those cruel public brandings that had painted a proud black man as something he was not. There were brief reconciliations between the two over the years, fleeting moments of warmth, but the deepest wound never fully closed. The man who had once lent Ali money and fought for his return to the ring carried the hurt of being mocked and misrepresented all the way to his final days. And yet, consider what Joe Frazier truly was, a sharecropper's son, the 12th child of a one-armed farmer, born into a world that measured a black man's worth by his usefulness in a field. A boy who built his own heavy bag out of rags and corncobs
and beat it under an oak tree until his knuckles toughened. A teenager driven north on a Greyhound bus, alone at 15, with a permanently bent arm and a dream his uncle had spoken aloud.
A champion who fought half-blind and never told a soul. The first man on earth to defeat Muhammad Ali. The money vanished. The land slipped away. The statue went to a character from the movies. But none of that can touch what he built with his own crooked left hand. Joe Frazier did not need a bronze likeness on the museum steps to be remembered. He earned his place among the greatest heavyweights who ever lived. And he earned it the only way he ever knew how, by getting up, again and again, no matter how many times the world knocked him down.